This afternoon's guest is quite simply one of the world's most versatile screen actresses. She is president of this year's International Film Festival here in Berlin. She won an Oscar for Michael Clayton. She won the Venice Best Actress Award for Edward II. She's worked with a whole slew of wonderful directors and very offbeat directors, from Derek Jarman to David Fincher. And she is, I think, one of the best advertisements, not only for Britain, but also for Scotland that I can think of. And we're going to show you a quick reel which illustrates her career, and then we'll be able to talk to Tilda Swinton. Thank you. So let's run the clip, please. Oh, that was an impressive entrance for you.
Dark, it's fantastic.
And you told me just before we came on that actually you'd played in this theatre once.
Yes, I had a strange feeling of déjà vu as I was standing at the back. And I played Mozart in this theatre in 1988, in German, I have to tell you. It was a production that we made in Vienna, where the outrage was not that I was a woman, but that I wasn't Austrian.
Tilda, the theme of this year's Talent Campus is turning points in a career, and for directors, I guess, turning points within a film too. But was there a particular turning point that made you, after Cambridge and the Royal Shakespeare, decide to be a screen actress, or did you meet someone who made that happen?
Well, the honest truth was, I never wanted to be an actress of any kind. I was always a writer. I was going to be a writer. I went to university as a writer. I had an entrance based on the fact that I was a writer. And the second I arrived at Cambridge, I stopped writing and started to perform in a sort of slightly half-hearted way. I was looking for a camera, but there weren't cameras at Cambridge at that time, and I started working in the theatre, but always very half-heartedly. I was never really that interested in the theatre. And after
the Stephen Fry generation was
I was younger than Stephen Fry, but I was doing the sort of, I was more into Brecht, I have to tell you. I was not doing the Stephen Fry department. So I left Cambridge really confused, not knowing what on earth I was going to be doing, regretting desperately not having gone to art school, honestly. And I attempted to test whether I was really an actor by going to the Royal Shakespeare Company, as you mentioned, which was the best thing I could possibly do, because I proved to myself once and for all that I was not interested in that at all. And then, and this comes to answer your point, a door opened because I met Derek Jarman. And that really is, maybe your question about turning points, it would be more poetic for a turning point to come in the middle of a career or the middle of a life. Mine really came at the very beginning. I don't know, honestly, if I had met Derek Jarman, I don't know whether I would be performing in films at all, because at that time, what I saw available to me, it just wasn't attractive to me. I knew I didn't want to work in the theatre, that was easy, and I knew that I didn't want to work in television. There wasn't really a cinema of a kind that I felt any kind of kinship with. We're talking about the middle of the 80s, and there wasn't really a film industry in the UK as such at that time. There were some quite grand British directors like Richard Attenborough and Alan Parker, who were kind of making big films in Hollywood, and I was never attracted to that at all. I just didn't know what to do, and when I met Derek Jarman, a number of possibilities became clear. First of all, he was the first practicing artist that I ever met. And the closet art student in me was now in a world of art, having not been to art school. But more than that, he was a filmmaker who was an artist making films, and there was a place for me in them. And we didn't even know at the time what that place might be, but over 8 years and 7 films, I was able to do this stuff, and some of which you put in your clip tonight. I mean, it's fascinating to see the collection of clips that were put here. I mean, some of these films, nobody's seen, and I'm really impressed that, you can't call crawling towards a Super 8 camera acting. But I was able to do it with Derek Jarman, and I was able to, put on a big dress and cut it apart with scissors and have it at the end of The Last of England, and for that film to be shown in the Prince Charles Cinema off Leicester Square in 1989. There was a place for our kind of cinema then, and in that there was a place for some strange sort of performer like me. So I had 8 years of just not being an actress, but finding a way of being in front of a camera.
He was a very special person because he was outside the general context of British cinema, that respectable British cinema you mentioned. What kind of man was he? I mean, when he directed you, was he different to other directors in the way he got the best performance out of you, do you think? Were you inspired by that?
Well, all directors are different from other directors. He was, in many senses, he wasn't a director at all. He was a painter who chose to make films for the company and put together a group of people and delegated. He was very good at throwing a party and just letting us get on with it, which meant that, in a sense, he made filmmakers of all of us, whether we were as Simon Turner was writing music for film, he always wrote the music for his films, and Sandy Powell, who made the costumes, the filmmakers who worked cameras for him, all became filmmakers with Derek, because Derek just delegated. Derek worked under there was a sort of haute couture and a pret-a-porter Derek. I mean, it depends which way you put it. Or there was Red Label and, Derek Light. And I would say Derek Light was when he worked with a script with 35 millimeter in a more orthodox way. And for those films, which were Caravaggio, which was the first film I made with him, Edward II, The War Requiem, there were scripts. And when you have scripts, of course, you have to raise budgets. And when you're dealing with 35 millimeter, you need to have a kind of plan. And then, of course, real Red Label Derek was the Super 8 stuff, which was entirely experimental, very often, always actually, not scripted. We would just collate material over the course of a year or so, and then after a year we would look at what we had, and then it was rather like putting together an anthology of poetry. We would then go, well, we've got that sequence, and maybe we need a sequence where this happens, and then we would go away and shoot it for 2 days, and then we would put it together, and then we would try and raise money to make a print and distribute it.
Had he not died so young, do you think today he would be making bigger feature films, or would he have pursued the same?
I know one thing, whatever he would be doing, we couldn't possibly imagine it now. Yeah. It would be something entirely unexpected that he would justify. Yes. It would be something transgressive in the sense that it would be, I don't know, advertising Nike or something, and telling us how that was the most radical thing he could possibly do in the climate of today. Yeah. And it would mean something.
Yes. Another very inspiring director you worked with was Sally Potter, and we've got a clip from, well, there was a little clip from Orlando, but we've got a clip from Orlando which I'd love to show and then ask you to comment on it. Okay, could we have that clip from Orlando, please? First one. So, please. Did Sally approach you about doing that film from the get-go, or was it something you'd always wanted to play?
Well, I met Sally one day. Well, I knew her anyway, and she rang me up and she asked me to come for tea, and And we met in a cafe, and she put down between us Virginia Woolf's novel, which I had read. And of course, like most of the young people, I would say, who read Orlando of an open mind, I felt that it was my talismanic book, and said, I want to make a film of this. And I said yes. And 5 years later, we managed to have some material. It was a really long, hard struggle making that film, but a struggle I'm so proud of for that. That was 1988, and we started on this really hilarious journey going around the world with really absolutely no reputation at all. I mean, I'd done a few films with Derek, and she'd done a few well-regarded but not widely seen at all experimental films under the auspices of the BFI, and we went around the world with this project, which was inevitably going to be relatively expensive, and people would say, well, what's the story? And we went into really high-level meetings saying, well, it's about immortality and androgyny, and it's about class, and it's about love and death in the universe. And people would say, yes, and what's the story? And we would say, well, it's about, and it went on and on and on, and they would say, a costume film? Because at that time, nobody made costume films. It was very impossible to imagine. And finally, we went, and we kept doing this really interesting thing, which I still stand by. It's a kamikaze approach. You know, when there are nothing but closed doors around you, you just have to act as if they're open. You just have to keep going. And we took out overdrafts and dressed ourselves in clothes that made us look like we, you know, could afford them. And we went out and talked to people in Cannes and went to New York and I was remembering this the other day in the most terrible kind of nightmare, that we went to New York, someone held a cocktail party for us, and I read sections of the book out loud to grand people in New York. We were desperate. I mean, it was terrifying. Anyway, we eventually went on a recce for eventual locations to Russia. And it was just at the time when the studios were kind of being broken up, and there was some small independent sections of the big Moss film and Len film were kind of having these independent sections. And we were asked, what film do you want to make? And we said, oh, it's a film about immortality and androgyny and class and life and death in the universe. And people said, we get that.
Tchaikovsky.
and the first money that came forward was from Russia. And we made a Russian, Uzbek, British, French, Italian, Dutch co-production.
Which did very well. I mean, it had wonderful reviews.
It certainly had a longer life than we were given to understand it might. It has a very, and I must say, I saw it not that long ago myself on the big screen, and there's talk about it being re-released next year. It's next year already. This year, they're talking about re-releasing it, and I do hope they do, because it's very fresh. It's fresher. It has that kind of wildness in it that a lot of the films made at that time do, which people have kind of stopped making films with that kind of wildness. It's all got a bit neat. And
it inspired a sort of revival of Virginia Woolf, because Vanessa Redgrave made Mrs. Dalloway.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Soon after.
Yes.
And then, of course, The Hours now has come. So you really started something there, because for many decades she'd lain in limbo. She was taught at schools, and we all had to read her going to university, but didn't have that really contemporary.
Well, she's one of those writers who legendarily writes very cinematically, and people are constantly talking about how great it would be to make films of her writing, but because her writing has that thing in it which kind of pure cinema can approach, which is a sort of attention to the present moment, to time, and like all ambitious films, people say it's impossible to make a film of Virginia Woolf, so it's worth trying.
Before we go on to another clip, I'd like you to talk about the acting tradition in England, because Britain, we have a reputation of producing classical actors, we're well-trained, articulate, very controlled. You did a lot of drama on the side at Cambridge, as you said. And when I saw that compilation, I realized how well you articulate every word and how most Hollywood actors do not. You know, you hear Harrison Ford, you have to put subtitles on the DVD to understand.
Speaking American.
Yeah, but really, that's right, speaking American. I mean, do you think that acting schools are important for young actors, or do you think they can be literally taken straight off the street and put into film?
You know, Peter, I really am the last person who should talk about this, because I really honestly do not, and we can talk about, and you can test me, you can put electric things on my toenails. I don't know anything about acting, and I don't want to know anything about acting. I think that people do teach people things at acting schools. I have no idea what they are. I pass. I really don't know. I'm sure that there are things that theatre actors can learn in schools. I'm sure there are people in here who we should get up here to tell us what they are. I don't really know. I mean, there are, of course, practical things that experience of filmmaking can teach one about making films. But in terms of performance, film performance, personally, I have a taste for, less acting, the better. And I would rather have, my favorite film performance of all time is the donkey in Bresson's Au hasard Balthazar. It would that I could be that donkey. I have an aversion for acting in film as an audience. I find a kind of articulacy quite difficult to take. I think you're right. I think that British actors have a reputation for it, and they probably get it from theatre experience, and they probably get it from
the balcony up there.
Yeah, but they also probably get it from writers who have written for the theatre, who are now writing for the cinema, and directors that are the same. I think there's an interesting difference.
Sure. Well, we have a clip from Julia, which was shown here at the Berlinale last year, directed by a French director, Eric Zonka, and takes place on the west coast of America and in Mexico. And I remember seeing it and being very impressed with your playing a lush, or someone who's perpetually drunk or hungover, and then reading a few months later that in fact you were not very partial to drink in private life. And so I wondered, how did you play that, and how does one play a drunk?
You hang out with a lot of drunks. That's what you do. I realized a funny thing when we came to shoot this film, and I was so interested in doing it, but I had only one technical reserve, which was that I am a hopeless drunk. And what I mean by that is that I really can't do it. I would drink, that much wine and fall asleep or be sick. I didn't quite know how I was going to approach being very drunk in the film. And then I realized that it came very easily, and I realized that I've actually been pretending to be drunk my whole life because I'm always the one at the party who's not drinking, but pretending to drink and having a great time, probably even better time than everybody else. And then when the police are called, I'm the one who can answer the door and turn the music down and drive everybody home.
You're everyone's favorite driver.
I'm the designated driver.
But you were literally, I would say, in almost every scene you were tipsy, weren't you, in that film, virtually?
Well, some people think they have to be.
Yeah. Very underrated film, anyway, for what it's worth.
Well, it's like all interesting work. It has its time and place, and it's bleeding itself out into the world. It's having all sorts of interesting releases all over the place. I'm very proud of the film. I think it's. We set out to make not just a film about an alcoholic, but an alcoholic film. Nice. And I really believe that we achieved it. I mean, I think it's hard to leave the cinema after seeing Julia without feeling a little like you're going to have a hangover the next day.
Well, could we have the clip from Julia, please? Very hard to hit your marks, I should think. Very hard to hit your marks when you're lurching around.
There weren't many marks on that film, I can tell you. There's Eric Zonka saying, "The traffic, Tilda, go in now!" In the heart of Mexico City. Yeah, no stunt drivers either.
I would say your career has really blossomed in the last 3-4 years. I mean, you've worked with the Coen brothers on Burn Without Reading, a great part. You've worked with Tony Gilroy on Michael Clayton. You've worked with Jim Jarmusch, a very interesting part as Penny in Broken Flowers, where you've got a lot of resentment in your character, right? I mean, do you find sometimes directors bring you those roles where you have to sort of express this resentment or this?
Well, it's funny you talking, every time you mention my career, I feel a little bit embarrassed because the truth is I'm not really aware of having one. I never set out to have a career, as I've already confessed. It is true that in the last few years there has been a sort of strange semblance of a shape of a sort of career, and that hasn't been a mistake. It's been to do with two things. One thing which has been out of my control, and another which has been entirely my decision. I have to say, and I say this sitting in Europe, that there came a point where I realized that making really, for my money, incredibly interesting and experimentally important cinematic films doesn't necessarily mean that you mean anything in the market, which means that I was spending a lot of time with my friends sitting around while they got drunk, complaining about the fact that they couldn't get their films made. And I became more and more concerned that I meant nothing to the market. And there was a point when I decided to be open to offers. And that part I did have, responsibility for. You do have the opportunity in yourself to be open or to be closed. And I did make the decision to just, go surfing. Having said that, I didn't really have to do any more than that. I didn't go anywhere. I just stayed in Scotland. And fortunately, people started to send me ideas. And fortunately, I'd worked for long enough in my own skin and in my own world that people kind of knew what they might be getting. And so the people who got in touch with me were people like, in the first case, Lynn Hershman on the west coast of America, and then Spike Jonze, and then Andrew Adamson, and then Francis Lawrence, and then the Coen brothers, and then Tony Gilroy, and then David Fincher. And so I actually think the fact that those industrial films, because they're all made by interesting filmmakers, but let's face it, they are industrial, those films. And being on the bottom of a film poster for anyone, any one of those films, really helps get those films made that I'm going to be making over the next 2 years, I can tell you. Really does. They're all really interesting filmmakers. And I think it says more about the studios, that the studios during this time have been employing people like Andrew Adamson, who is a properly righteous dude, who, to make their $200 million Disney film, and one of Andrew Adamson's favorite films was Orlando. I mean, that says more about the studios that they would employ Andrew than that Andrew would ask me. It's been the mountain coming to Muhammad rather than the other way around, but I've been very blessed.
Well, now having worked on both sides of the Atlantic, is there a difference, a palpable difference in the way a film is shot in Europe and the way it's shot in Hollywood?
I'm not a great respecter of those geographical boundaries. I think it's, I cut it a different way. That I have more in common with the filmmaking of someone on the west coast of America like Lynn Hershman than I do many industrial filmmakers in the UK. Mm-hmm. I think that the real difference is for the sake of shorthand, I would say the studio system and what can loosely be described as the independent sector. And I don't mean the codependent studio-ish type of sector. I mean the truly independent sector that I'm used to. And the basic difference is this: when you are working on these huge studio films, you have to remember that the creativity happens months ago, sometimes even years ago. When you come to spend $200 million, you don't leave anything to chance. There's a checklist, and people go, it's going to be done exactly like that, and we're going to show you the reel of how it's going to be done, and they show it to you, and then you go and you do it. When you're working with nobody looking over your shoulder and very little budget, and you're in a location, and you wrote down a scene which says bright sunlight, and it's raining, and you have the location until 6 o'clock, and there's no way you're going to be able to come back. You have to be creative right now. You have to think, and you have to make a decision. You can't just sit around and wait for the weather to change. And that is a really, really big difference. I mean, that working in one of those systems might suit somebody very well. Working in another might suit another very well. But there's no reason to believe that if you're happy in one system, you would be happy in another.
Well, there is that European-style filmmaking in America. We had one of our earlier guests this week was Anne Carey, with whom you made Thumbsucker.
Yes.
And that's the kind of film that could have been made in Europe.
Absolutely. But that's why I say the geographical boundaries are misleading, I think. I mean, it's much more, there's an sort of, it's more a question of sensibility, and of course about money, because sensibility brings with it a kind of, price ceiling. I think if you are looking for colleagues and you're feeling hidebound in your own geographical space, don't forget that there's a wide planet out there, and you'll probably find colleagues on the other side of the world.
Yes. Well, we have a final clip, which is from Michael Clayton, the end of the film, and when that's finished, I think it would be nice if the audience could ask you some questions. So could we have the final clip, please? Well, we have hosts and hostesses in the aisles, and so please wait for the mic to come to you so that you'll be as part of this conversation. And first lady I see is in the fourth row. That's exactly
it. I'm very curious to know what your next challenge will be in your so-called, not called career. And because you've been in so much, genres and different types of film, from Hollywood to the other alternative side, and maybe this question I should specify better in the sense that for your personal being as a person, what would interest you now as a role?
For once, I know the answer to that question. I'm happy to say that I am in the throes of starting a whole new kind of cycle in my life. With my friend Mark Cousins, who's a film writer and a cultural critic, we have inaugurated a foundation called the 8.5 Foundation, which is for, when I say it's for cinema for children, I mean I have to think of a quick way of saying this because it's very new, it's hot off the press. Our idea is we want to inaugurate a birthday for children globally, their 8.5th birthday. And on this day, we want to be able to send them a gift of a film of their choosing from a website which we are going to set up, which we are going to curate, which will be offering a broad menu of films that we curate that they would otherwise not be able to see. Anyone with children will tell you that being able to show cinema to children of a certain age now is becoming increasingly difficult when the only cinemas you can go to are the multiplexes and the only films that you can show them are Disney or Pixar films. My children are a laboratory experiment. They're 11 now. And they don't watch television, but they are probably amongst the most cine-literate people that I know. And they have absolutely no idea that the films of Michael Powell are not for them. They have no idea that Laurel and Hardy are not for them, or the Marx Brothers, or La Belle et la Bête. They've been watching these films since they were younger than 8.5, and they've inspired us to start this foundation. So that's one thing that we're going to be doing. But associated to that, we're also starting a series of roving film festivals. We started last year in the small town that I live in the north of Scotland. We made a film festival in an old abandoned bingo hall of our favorite DVDs, and it became a kind of sensation. And we realized that, in every small town across the world, let alone Northern Europe, there is at least one, if not two, cinema-shaped holes. The old supermarket used to be a cinema. And where I live, if you want to go and have the experience of cinema, you have to go to an enormous multiplex and see Pirates of the Caribbean. And we put on this little festival, and it's called the Cinema of Dreams. And next month, we've been commissioned by the Scottish government to make a Scottish version in Beijing. And then later this year, we mean to do another edition in Scotland, the plans for which are completely secret, because it feels like these things work if they're a complete surprise. We have a plan to inaugurate these roving festivals in refugee camps in Somalia, etc. This is what I'm going to be doing now.
Question, lady in the front row. Yeah. And then I'll come to the balcony. I always forget the balcony. But
the balconies. There are two balconies. The Uber balcony, which is right, and then there's one up there.
So, hi, I'm Cecilia. And first of all, I have to say thank you very much. You're here with us. And I admire a lot. And I loved your Julia last year, really. It was great. So, if you said you have completely no idea about acting or camera acting, I would, as an actress, I would like to know how do you prepare a part? How do you prepare a role? Do you speak also with the directors, the studio directors, or the independent directors? Do you speak with your husband about that? How do you prepare a role?
Well, when I am required to not be entirely myself, as in, for example, a lot of my work, I'm required to do nothing at all. When I am required to disguise myself as a middle American lawyer or a frustrated Washington housewife or a superhuman witch, I just make it my business to do everything I can before we start to shoot. To eradicate the distractions. First of all, to make myself as convincing physically as I can be, so that there isn't a feeling that once we start to shoot, I have to act at all. My feeling is that, for me, acting is dressing up and playing. It's nothing more than that. I love to play. I don't like to act, but I do love to play. You know the difference. It's a kind of aliveness. And anyone with children or who can see children of any age playing will know what I mean. It's just a kind of aliveness that you don't often see on the screen, actually. And in order to be free to be like that, I just want to reduce the possibility that someone will say, that's Tilda Swinton, which of course they will do. I mean, I always intended to be in one film and never in any other, because I love to see a new person, and I mind it when I recognize them from another film. I really do. To try and forget the image of another film, to try and forget a rhythm, is an effort for the audience. And there's something very luxurious about seeing someone for the first time. But given that I have been in more than one film, now I have to be in so many that I'm trying to become a donkey. So I try and, spend a lot of time disguising myself, literally. If my body is not appropriate, I will change it if I can. Julia, for example. Julia's wired in a very different way from me. I'm more than almost any other person that I've played. She's really very different. I mean, sometimes it's possible to say that you bring something out of yourself for a part, but in Julia, really, I feel like I put myself in something other. And that meant that I had to really disguise myself. I had to build a body that looked wrecked, that looked like I might have been drinking for 25 years, too long. And dressing the character is incredibly important. You only have 90 minutes or 200, whatever, however many it is, depending if you're working with Bellatar, you have 8 hours. But you don't have long in the cinema to take somebody into a human life. And you have to work very fast in establishing all these little codes. So dress, what's the English, the Haltung, the bearing of a character, is the wiring of a character is what I try and think of. And I try and think of it before we start shooting, and then once we start shooting, I try not to think at all. Yeah, I try not to work at all.
Should we go upstairs? Is someone upstairs would like to ask a question? Yes, we've got one on the right there. Where's it going to end up? Oh, that's going a long way around. Is it working?
Okay.
There you go.
As I understand that you've been sitting as a jury in several film festivals, including this year in Berlinale. So as an actor, how do you assess other actors' performance?
It's a difficult one.
I don't know that I assess anything as an actor. And I don't believe that I'm here as an actor. I don't believe, obviously, this jury is a jury that makes it very clear that we're not here only as filmmakers, because we have people on this jury who are not filmmakers at all. We're here as audience. And I think that I wonder how much my experience of being in front of a camera dictates my taste in performance. I don't know. Maybe it does, but I don't really know how to answer that question. I don't know how to imagine that I hadn't been making films for 23 years. But I think what I am looking for always is a kind of energy that's real, that's not acted, that's and that's appropriate to the frame also. I mean, I think that a responsible performer and a responsible filmmaker will be in dialogue about the frame. It is possible to have a really beautifully shot and beautifully directed film with an inappropriate performance that jars. And I think part of the director's and the performer's responsibility is to keep a kind of rhythm that's appropriate to the frame. If I'm in a frame with Peter, I need to know that. If I'm in a frame with this bottle and the bottle is in the foreground and I'm very small in the background, I need to know that. If I'm in a frame in close-up, I need to know that. And I will work with that frame. And I think that it's something that a director can really help an actor with, to make them a part of the process of knowing how the film is unfolding, how the pictures are, because they are pictures after all. I think maybe that's something that theatre actors find quite difficult to adjust to because they're so used to, just being in this space, and this space doesn't change, and your ability to approach this space doesn't change as you sit in the theatre. So I don't know. I think I'm just looking for a kind of just something that doesn't distract me, something that makes me be in the film, and a concentrated and relaxed performance can really do that.
Lady down here in the second row.
I still think on the last extract from film that we have seen, it's so intensive. Do you have sometimes nightmares? Because it's so, when you think of that role and you were very drunk, and then your life is over, and when you're playing those women, can you sleep well, or?
No, I'm the lucky one. I don't have to have the nightmares because I make the films. No, I don't have nightmares. I mean, it's however intense the film is, it's always going to be less intense making it, because even though we make it over several weeks and we have other things to contend with, like long shooting hours and Mexican traffic and whatever else, at least we are able to pace ourselves. And in the cinema, of course, you are getting it, full frontal.
And how you take the distance? How do you say it's over? No, I'm not playing.
I have heard what I would call real actors talking about how difficult it is for them to not take stuff home, and I'm always very impressed by it, and it means nothing to me at all. As I say, it's dressing up and playing. It's just dressing up and playing.
But that particular scene, was that rehearsed a great deal in advance to achieve that intensity?
The Julia?
Yeah. No, the Michael Clayton.
Michael Clayton. Oh, well, the Michael Clayton was pretty, even though it was a relatively low-budget Hollywood film, it was still, pretty orthodoxly laid out. And that scene, one of the things you have to remember about that scene is that it's incredibly finely written. Yeah. And it was, the camera moves meant that we had to know exactly, there were marks being hit in that scene. We didn't do it that many times. We rehearsed it a couple of times, and we shot it fairly swiftly. But it was pretty precision. It was an interesting scene to shoot because the two characters are on such different tracks. The one character, the George Clooney character, is absolutely driving home one point, and this other character, the character that I'm playing, is just trying to deflect, trying to find any way of deflecting, like a child when you catch them out. And so we needed to rehearse it a few times to get that. But once we got into the groove, it was really a pleasure. It's a pleasure to work with that kind of writing, because Tony Gilroy knows that he's an intelligent enough writer to know that sometimes people are articulate, but more often or not, they're not. Most people are not articulate. I think it's a great problem with a lot of writing, that writers are very tempted to make everybody very articulate, like they're all playwrights. And I have a particular taste for inarticulacy. I think it's really interesting.
And I guess, I'm supposing here, this came from when you were a young lady, a young girl, in your hometown in Scotland, Nairn, I guess. Could you tell me if this dressing up and playing was done with a Scottish accent?
Okay, number of corrections I need to make. First of all, I was not in that town. Secondly, I don't know if I was ever a young lady. Thirdly, I never had a Scottish accent. I'm from the kind of Scottish family who send their children away to England to educate them so that when they come back to oppress the Scottish people, they can't understand what they're saying. But I realized recently that, of course, one of the things that gave me my love of dressing up is that I'm a soldier's daughter. And I spent my childhood seeing my father dressed up in these fantastic uniforms. I had a wonderful experience not that long ago when my father and I had a business-like conversation about gold braid, because I was made a very beautiful dress by Yves Saint Laurent, which had a kind of gold lace collar. And I had a very serious conversation with my general father about how best to pack it, what acid-free tissue paper I should use to preserve. He was very knowledgeable. I never thought that he and I would connect on this fashion point, but it was a great bonding moment.
That's difficult. I think anybody from the balcony? One more from the balcony, and then one more from below, I think. Is anybody? Yes, the over balcony, exactly. Uber balcony. No microphone? It's coming. And then we'll have one more, and then Tilda has to go off.
Oh, hello. I was just wondering if you could talk about maybe how old you were when you started to sort of get the confidence to push your playing and dressing up into something that you really thought that you could take to the world, and you sort of take your creativity and, I suppose, show it to people.
That's an amazing question. I've never thought of that question before. I mean, as I've said, I really can't imagine. I mean, I'm finding it very interesting this year being here, because my experience of Berlin, which is the very first film festival I ever came to, with the first film I ever made with Derek Jarman, who was my home in filmmaking. And honestly, to come here as the president of the jury, having not really ever left myself behind. I mean, yes, I've been on a bit of a Hollywood adventure recently, but I've never had to leave myself behind. I find it really quite moving, because it makes me realize that when we were making these experimental films in the 80s, we were onto something, that there was something that people have kind of wanted, which is a sort of, I don't know, an access to some kind of real experience, quite outside of good acting or, good interpretation of classical texts or anything. And so I suppose the short answer is, in the Jarman laboratory in the 80s, I think the idea that I could, there are no photographs of me between the ages of 10 and 21. I was completely phobic. I am extraordinarily shy and never wanted to be photographed. And I think that on a kind of existential level, working with Derek Jarman, being around him with his Super 8 camera, getting used to looking into the camera, which I did in the first 10 of my films, even big 35mm films like Orlando, I'm looking in the camera. Just getting used to the idea of being scrutinized, getting used to the idea that I could be there without acting. It was possible to somehow just exist and not be shy. That was all made possible by Derek Jarman and that time. And to be honest with you, I'm not really doing anything very different now. I mean, yes, I'm all dressed up with dyed black hair and a big, fat suit and whatever, and with George Clooney. But it still feels connected somehow. It's me pretending to be a Hollywood actress, but it's still me.
Well, we have time for just one more question.
This
It's so
person is
difficult.
right in the middle.
Let's go with you in the front row.
Well, when I watch films, of course I know that the actors are real persons, but usually I don't really believe it. So seeing you there is like you jumped out of a book, and what sensation is it for you to see yourself as an angel or as a witch or a drunken woman or things like that?
The funny thing is that the more, I was watching those clips in the wings, and it gets easier because there are so many more. It's like a flip book, blah, 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 and they're so different. And I'm fond of all of them for different reasons, because it is my personal album, what you just saw, the relationships and the times of my life, and most of those projects, most of those experiences were really, personally very important to me. So it gets easier the more there are. But as I say, it's a little bit like the more there are, the more I can see myself in them. I think it was more difficult earlier on when there were maybe only 3 or 4. But now that there's so many, it's sort of, it's like an old family album, really. But it is just dressing up and playing. It's possibly similar to when you look at your own photographs of yourself. If you look at your photographs of yourself 20 years ago, or even in the pram, it's just you, and then you're dressed up in different ways and standing with different people. That's all it is.
What do your children think of your performances?
Oh, my children are not really that impressed. They until very recently, of course, they couldn't really see any of my films. They were, until the Narnia film, they didn't really know what I did at all. And then the Narnia film came out, and they weren't very exposed to it, because where we live, it's happily very free of the tentacles of the Disney Corporation. There are not many posters around. But they went to see a Pixar film, and they saw a clip of it, and they told me that they didn't want to see the film because it was too loud. So I thought that was kind of great, and I took great pleasure in telling the executives at Disney that there was 2 tickets in the world that would not be sold. But eventually they saw it on a DVD, and they're very bemused by the Narnia film, because they think the wrong side won. So they don't really get it. They don't think it's very good for that reason. They were extras in the second Narnia film, so they're a little bit more involved. And the older they get, the more they've been on film sets now. And my son is very interested in the camera, I have to say. So they're sort of, getting to be more interested in filmmaking in general. But they don't really like to see images of me dressed up. I wouldn't want to see my mother dressed up as... I think they're very healthy.
Well, Tilda, may the next 2 years be really fruitful for you, your foundation, the festival, and maybe some films. And thank you for spending this time with us. We appreciate it, as you can tell.